is an artist and a pedagogue. He received his MFA and BFA from Kala Bhavan, Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan, where he currently, if I'm not mistaken, heads the department of painting. He is an in demand scenographer and installation artist. He lives and works in Shantiniketan. Thank you for joining us today, Sanchayan. Could you please join us on stage? Thank you. Prateek Raja, along with his wife, his partner Priyanka Raja, who's also come here today. Thank you, Priyanka, for joining us. Launched Experimenter in 2009 in Kolkata. Experimenter, which is one of our cutting edge art galleries, critically acclaimed program, is considered a pace setter of contemporary art from the region. It also hosts the annual Experimenter Curators Hub and publishes artist books through its publishing arm, Experimenter Books, runs the Experimenter Learning Program, ELP, and Experimental Labs, an inclusive experimental online platform for future thinking. Prateek Raja is a founding member of the International Gallery Alliance and a selection committee member of Art Basel, Basel. Thank you for agreeing to moderate today's session, Prateek, and please welcome to the stage. I can now see Sumathi on screen. Sumathi, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Yes? We can't quite. Maybe, do you need to unmute yourself?
Yes, I do. I'm so
Hi.
sorry. I had muted myself. Good evening to you.
Good evening and welcome.
Apologies.
I was waiting for you to do the informal introduction. Sumati Ramaswamy is James B. Duke Professor of History and International Comparative Studies and Chair of the Department of History, Duke University, Durham, North Carolina, in the States. She has published extensively on language politics, gender studies, spatial studies, and the history of cartography, visual studies, and the modern history of art, and more recently, digital humanities and the history of philanthropy. She is a co-founder of Tasveer Ghar, a digital network of South Asian popular visual culture. The book of hers, which has been shortlisted for the Wow Book Awards and which we are discussing today, is Gandhi in the Gallery, Art of Disobedience. I would now like to welcome Sumathi. What time is it there for you, Sumathi?
Oh, it's not so bad. It's 8 a.m. So thank you for fitting me into the schedule nicely. Appreciate it.
First cup of coffee yet?
Yeah, well, I did have my cup of tea. I'm a South Indian, but I drink tea.
Ah, okay. So I'll hand over to Prateek Raja and invite him to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjum,
Thank
and
you.
thank you, Value of Words, for inviting us to this evening of a beautiful, hopefully, a beautiful conversation that we will have on this amazing book that Sumati I read about a few weeks ago, and surprisingly and happily surprisingly, Anjum invited me to speak about it with you and Sanchayan, which I'm extremely happy and thankful for. Um, um, Before I um, start, do you wanted to kind of talk about the book so that at least we set the, because this is an image book, it's an image heavy book, and it's about the arts. I thought maybe you want to maybe tell us a little bit about the book and share some images, because that will then put us in context of how to see the book in a way. Do you want to do that first?
Thank you. Yes, of course, Prateek. And I think Rishabh is waiting to pull up my PowerPoint. So, Rishabh, if you don't mind doing that so that people can get to see the images. Okay. So, can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah.
Terrific. So yes, the book was published, and first of all, thank you to the Value of the Words for this event, and Prateek and Sanchayan for joining me in a conversation. I'm really delighted to be here. and to talk about this book, which was published by Rowley Books in New Delhi in the course of a series of events that came to be called Gandhi at 150, marking the 150th anniversary of the birth of M.K. Gandhi. And in my experience, every time there is a significant anniversary of Gandhi's birth or death, there is a spike in both the scholarly and public interest in Gandhi, and also the artistic interest in Gandhi. So it is one of the things that I got interested in as I was working on this book. And of course, the 150th anniversary in 2019 was a very significant event. A lot of work, a lot of publicity happened around it, sparked off by the government of India, and artists also responded to it. And I know later in the conversation we may want to talk about the Venice Biennial, where Gandhi, of course, and the artworks on Gandhi were, of course, showcased. Next slide, please. So, my own interest in Gandhi and visual culture started about a decade ago when I published another book that whose cover you see here, called The Goddess and the Nation. And in that book, I was interested, among other things, in exploring the place of Gandhi in popular visual culture, in what is sometimes called bazaar art or calendar art, mass produced art. And he's often frequently shown in these works in the company of Mother India. He is, of course, pictured as her most dutiful son, though although paradoxically, as you all know, he was, of course, the father of the nation. So there is a very interesting gender dynamic there, which I've reflected upon off and on. Next slide, please. Now, in my Gandhi in the Gallery book, there are some examples of popular visual art, but the book focuses really on what I call gallery art, singular works of art that are produced for showcasing in galleries, museums, become collectors' items, and so on. So the audience for these singular works is very different, I would argue, than for mass-produced art. I do have examples of mass-produced art in the book, but my goal has been to focus very much on major and minor artists who have produced singular works on Gandhi. So, my primary motivation for publishing this book and publishing it in India with a publisher like Rowley was I wanted to reach a general public. For academic scholars like me, this is a huge challenge. We tend to write for our own peers, and the conversation often is about highly specific issues which are specific to our disciplines. But I really wanted to challenge myself and write for a larger audience without, of course, losing my scholarly peers as well. So it's a very delicate act, I think. And many scholars in India actually pull it off better than, people like me. So I'm full of admiration for people who write for both audiences. So I would be really curious to hear from both Prateek and Sanchayan whether you think I have managed to pull this off. And if not, I would really love to learn about how to, in fact, reach a general public. And in particular, intellectually, I was interested in doing this because as a scholar, I've noticed that there's often a big gap in the scholarly knowledge about especially a man like Gandhi and the public and popular knowledge about him. So that's another kind of challenge that scholars like me have to take on to understand how to reckon with the public's understanding of the father of the nation. But I also definitely and clearly wrote this book as a disciplinary historian. I am not an art historian. I work with images and on images, but very much I am trained to work with historical archives that are very verbally driven and word saturated. But I was very interested as a historian I began to see how visible Gandhi is in the visual realm and how I can take on a figure like this and write about him as a historian. But though I write as a historian, you will not find a historical arc of development in the book. Next slide, please. I do explore questions such as when and where and in what context Gandhi first comes to the attention of the professional artist of India. For example, these are some of the earliest works works that I was able to find in the archive, so to speak. The work, especially on the right, Lalit Mohan Sen's a beautiful woodcut, is a very early work by the artist, and it was actually done when he was based in London. It was commissioned for printing in the Daily Telegraph, which he had where he had also been, where he had also printed a work on Tagore. And in the book, I really only focus on artists, or largely focus on artists were based in India, who are Indian, who work in India, and so on. But I have an ongoing interest as well in how the global artistic community has pictured and has taken Gandhi on as an artistic project. Next slide, please. Another early work I explore, for which I'm very grateful actually to Professor Shivakumar in Shantiniketan, who brought it to my attention and also secured for me a high-res image from the Kalabhavan archives, is this beautiful wash painting by Abanindranath Tagore, recalling a very crucial meeting between Gandhi, Tagore, and you can also see the figure of C.F. Andrews, and this happened in September 1921. And as a historian, of course, this is at the height of the non-cooperation movement. It was a very important encounter between the Mahatma and the poet about their differences on how to contest British rule. And it was fascinating for me that an artist like Tagore thought it was important to capture this. But I was also interested in this work, not just as a historian. The next slide, please. One of the purposes of this book is also to look at how there is a constant repurposing of former images into our time. So, for example, you see in this beautiful painting by the Vadodara-based artist Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh, how the Gandhi from the Tagore painting appears. And this is not the only one of Sheikh's works in which this motif appears over and again. And I think Sheikh is drawn, I've actually interviewed him for this painting, he's drawn to this work of Tagore's because it shows Gandhi at his dialogic best. And I think it's one of the purposes of, I believe that Sheikh Ghulam sees Gandhi's importance for our times in putting forth a dialogic mode of listening to the other, even if the other's point of view is different from ours. So I think that is one of the many reasons that Sheikh is drawn to the figure of Gandhi. Next slide, please. As a historian in the book, one of my other, really, I would say the major purposes of writing this book is my concern as a historian with the historical photograph. Gandhi, I have suggested, is the most photographed Indian of his time, and perhaps even since. Yet we actually know very little about the context in which his numerous photographs were taken. There is really no rigorous scholarship on the circulating history of these photographs, and even the best of historians who write on Gandhi, often uncritically, in my opinion, draw the photograph in, drop it in as an illustration, and move on. And of course, because my own work has been so image driven, I'm very conscious of the problems with this. But in this book, I really got very interested in how the historical, iconic photographs of Gandhi, but perhaps not even that iconic, get drawn, repurposed in very interesting ways by the contemporary artist. Next, please. So in the book, I have focused on what I call the afterlife of some photographs in some artworks. And I've explored the consequences of this kind of repurposing, but there is an enormous amount of work to be done in this area. And so I really hope scholars who read the book and get intrigued by this point go on to work on this. For me as a historian, fascinatingly, it's through works of art that I was actually led to many photographs. And I am actually, as a historian, doing a very different project on historical photographs of Gandhi and the ways in which context they were taken and so on. So it's really engaging with the artwork that has really helped me as a historian in this process. Next slide, please. So, as a historian, again, I'm very interested where images take me that the my engagement with words and the discursive archive do not. Hence, the three big themes of the book: the art of bearing, the art of walking, and the art of dying. All of these are all these. The reason I organized the book around these three themes is that these are issues which are not really that visible in the discursive world of words. But of course, there's an enormous amount of artistic investment in Gandhi's clothing and unclothing, if you will, on Gandhi as the strider, this iconic image of Gandhi with a danda, right, with a staff. And of course, an enormous body of work on Gandhi's death. So I came to see these works as illustrating what I have principally argued, which is the subtitle of the book, Gandhi at his most disobedient, as I've called it. As you know, Gandhi lived at an angle from the norm, questioning very conscientiously on the basis of very well stated moral principles the status quo. So I also see the act of bearing, the act of walking, and the act of dying actually as Gandhi at his most disobedient. And actually, it's engaging with these works of art that also made me realize how often Gandhi himself used the word art or its Hindi or Gujarati equivalent, kala, in his writings. In fact, he prolifically used this word to refer to all manner of things he did in the world, the art of living, and eventually, actually, the art of dying. His own death, he often referred to as an art. So I'm very, as a historian, working with these images, I became very interested in that question. And in fact, it is as a historian that, in fact, it is engagement with the images that led me to surprising things that I had not anticipated. Next, please. So, for instance, the coda, in the way the chapter 4 ends, which is a chapter on death, got very interested in the representational dilemmas that artists of India face when they try to show Gandhi's assassin, whether to show him or not becomes a big issue, and how to show the assassin and in what manner to show the moment of encounter. Next slide, please. And so you saw a very interesting painting by Debonjan Roy, and of course this beautiful painting by Sachin Karne, which we can come back to talk, if you will, called Ambush. So there is a profound irony throughout the book, which I reflect upon, that Gandhi himself was enormously ambivalent about the work of art, qua art, and he had some very strong opinions on this. So, in a very interesting way, the artists of India, I have argued, have willfully been disobedient to Gandhi in the lavish attention they have paid to him. In fact, he is, I think, the one Indian one political figure on whom so much art has been produced. And he's not yet been rivaled in this regard. So another argument in the book is what I call the visual culture of obedience that has emerged among the artists of India. There is very little by way of critique of Gandhi in this artwork, and that itself is fascinating for me. Next slide, please. In what even the occasional works emerge, which are trying to offer a visual critique, it is actually within the context of a larger deference to him, and I'm intrigued by this. Next slide, please. And in fact, what artists have ended up by doing is singularizing him. They extract him from the multitude that made him, that made the movement, that transformed Gandhi into the Mahatma, and instead he appears as this very singular figure towering over everybody. So artists of India, I have argued, have been hugely responsible in transforming Gandhi, occasionally with his complicity, into what I call a hyper icon and a larger than life iconic figure. And so signs of artistic disobedience, signs of visual critique are few and far between. For example, as we know, Gandhi had very conservative opinions on women and on gender relations. So I expected to see women artists of India produce some critical works. And so far, I really have not encountered this. I may be mistaken in this. I would love to hear from you both on this, but I have not seen this. Next slide, please. Where I have seen a very interesting emergent critique is among Dalit artists, and I've included in the book these two very interesting, tough works by J. Nandakumar, and there are some very critical works emerging by upcoming artists like Pinak Banek. On the other hand, next slide, please, artists of the stature of, say, Gigi Scaria, who lives and works in New Delhi, a fantastic artist who's produced a beautiful body of work, many of which I've analyzed in the book. Here is in this very recent work, reconciling Gandhi and Ambedkar. Next slide, please. And we see the same thing happening in the work of the Kochi, Bombay-based artist Riyaz Khomu, where Gandhi and Ambedkar are visually reconciled in a way that doesn't, as we know in Dalit discourse and even in scholarly writings, the Gandhi-Ambedkar differences are really prominent today. But in the visual realm, there's an attempt being made by such artists to bring them within the same frame and in conversation with each other. So I want to close with the image that is on the title of on the cover of my book. My next slide, please, which is Talur, Ellen, Mangalore, and soul-based, fantastic artist. And this is a beautiful work, a large work called Eraser Pro. And I chose this as the cover of the book because it, for me, exemplified the critical paradox that I have explored. Namely, that in spite of all of the lavishing of artistic attention on him, and notwithstanding the fact that the contemporary artist has emerged, as I've argued, as Gandhi's conscience keeper, Gandhi is still he's a hallowed figure in India, but he's also hollow. His image is everywhere. He's hyper visible, we would argue. He's actually perhaps over remembered, but really his complicated ideas are very, very much ignored. And certainly, I would say, a vast majority of Indians today at all. So for me, this image really captured the simultaneous way in which Gandhi hallowed figure, but also hollow figure. Thank you. I hope that laid out some of the big themes of the book.
For sharing your book with us and also taking us briefly through it. I mean, really the breadth and depth of research and the visual depiction of how, Gandhi is portrayed by artists, not just recently or historically, but across generations over 100 years, is pretty amazing, because we know that Gandhi's visited and revisited and spoken about by historians or anthropologists, or even emulated by global politicians for different reasons. But to see him across in such varied depiction across time by artists, in specifically fine artists in specific contexts of the gallery and museums, is quite revealing in a way. So thank you and congratulations for this book. I like the way you have titled the various chapters of the book. They are also lyrical, instead of they're lyrical and also visually appealing, because although they're chronologically set in a way, but they're not chronological in a way as well, because you speak about, as you said in the beginning, you speak about the actions that as artists look at Mahatma as a muse, converting him from the idea of the fakir man, as Churchill first described him, to the Mahatma that the global world saw him. And then, of course, the act of bearing, which Sanchayan and I will talk about a little bit. We spoke about how Gandhi was actively, in a way, building that image. And when the critique of Gandhi comes, I think that's something that we would like to speak about, and then the art of walking and fine art of dying, and finally the canvas of disobedience. So it's very beautifully put. So thank you for putting it in that way.
Thank you.
I would actually, before I bring Sanchayan into this conversation, I would like to ask you a very small question about. I know you said the motivation of the book, but what do you think? And Sanchayan, it can probably go to Sanchayan after this. What is the importance of writing or visually depicting a person, a complex person such as Gandhi, at this time now, where a lot of his ideals are in a way modified to suit a certain time, or even um, to understand him now? What does it mean? What does it mean for you as a scholar, and why is it important to visit him now?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. We live in very complex political times. And Gandhi has been put to purposes that are quite antithetical, as you very well know, to many of his ideas. So I think at the back of my mind, very much this is a political ethical project. There is no nostalgia for Gandhi. I have, as a scholar, but even as a global citizen, as a citizen of India, I have, my issues with Gandhi and the ways in which, he conducted his practice. So there's no nostalgia in this book, but I certainly was very invested politically, ethically, and intellectually in sort of, taking stock, if you will. There had been this body of work that has accumulated in the art world, and I was very intrigued by the fact that art historians who, have done they're amazing historians of art, both in India and globally, who work on India. But Gandhi has not been particularly taken up for consideration even by art historians. And so I really got interested in that. And I wondered if the art itself was seen as too political. Was it seen as a little naive, a little hero worshipping? So, as you know, art historians want to take on works that have a certain kind of critical edge to them, or a kind of commentary on certain kinds of contemporary issues. So I wondered if the sort of the refusal to engage with the figure of Gandhi in the world of art history is sort of sparked off by that. So I was, for that purpose also, I wrote this book. But most importantly and consciously, I wrote it as an argument with my fellow historians, who really only look at Gandhi from the perspective of his written word. And really, Gandhi really is visible in the public domain, not through his words anymore, but as this image. So, what historians have to take the image of Gandhi seriously, right? And any kind of historical reckoning we do with the historical figure has to take the image seriously, and what is being done with the image constantly, and how it comes to occupy a particular place in the world, right? Today, for example, I haven't taken this on at all in the book. For example, think of something like the Swachh Bharat campaign, which uses Gandhi's spectacles, you know, uh, for its purpose. That is an image. And, we can go on and on forever about this campaign and the manner in which a particular object that Gandhi used was first turned into a representation, and how that representation then comes to stand in for a whole new social movement, and one could argue a political movement, right? So I think part of the job of the historian is to set the record straight, if you will, or at least put things on the record again so it becomes a start of a conversation. So that's the way I would begin to respond to your very interesting question. I would love to hear what Sanchayan has to say on this, though.
That's something that I was also leading up to what we were talking about, Sanchayan, earlier, and in response to what Sumathi was saying, is about the idea of how Gandhi conducted himself to create, if I dare say, at that time, maybe not consciously, but clearly later in a conscious way, about the creation of, as now we can see it in different things, the brand of Gandhi. It's really a brand. He created himself as someone who could be recognizable anywhere. And in the book, we were discussing how consciously he was creating that. What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, congratulations with the book, in the sense it's really a very wide experience for the reader to come this wide range of images and how the whole idea of Gandhi has been constructed through history. I mean, I really like the collection, in the sense how you have put them together. And in fact, while looking at the images also, I was thinking that how the image of Gandhi was not just inside the body of Gandhi, but what is being constructed outside. I mean, through the gesture. I mean, and that how two very important gesture of Gandhi is being constantly repeated. I mean, this walking gesture and the sitting, which is again a very side angular sitting and not a very centralized sitting, and what it is creating to the environment that is happening out. And so this whole, I personally feel that Gandhi's adoption in the visual art has been mostly to satisfy a certain kind of a visual exploration or a practice, rather than looking at the entity, what Gandhi is trying to propose. I mean, it was more of looking at certain genre of practice, and Gandhi very easily fits into that, the idea of individuality, the idea of disobedience, the idea of protest, the idea of setting a kind of a flux, being in the trance, so these are domains which has been dealt in the visual art language also in the last 100 years very much. So somewhere Gandhi as a sign becomes very like a symbol, very easily fits into that domain. But the thing which I think was what was interesting for me with Gandhi is denouncing certain kind of a performativeness with his own body and engaging in the publicness of a country which has its own history of public culture, and then also counterposing it to the colonial Victorian verticality with certain kind of process of action, certain kind of process of enactments, which I think was a very conscious thing. And while reading your book also, I was thinking of that whole looking at every small mundane activities of daily life as an artwork. It's almost like Joseph Beuys talking 50 years before. I mean, it's like looking at all these different nuances. And how really art practice in public space has really responded to Gandhi. That was also very provoking while looking at the book, because one level it was the image culture that was emerging, and there were a lot of artists who were investing time to reconstruct the idea of Gandhi itself. But as a public action, what was initiated by Gandhi through the materiality, choice of materials, because most of his movements are based on material ideas, whether it is the salt or it is the khadi or burning
Spinning.
of clothes, or so there is a certain strong material notion through which he is trying to generate a certain kind of engagement. And very interestingly, I do not find that association in the visual culture that has come from the different kinds of practices. Especially, I would say, today when we look at Gandhi, I think there is a huge amount of learning that needs to be done for practitioners who are engaging in the public domain. Situating the body somewhere, I mean, situating it in a location, situating it in a practice, and then derive tools from the context and necessarily not impose methods from outside. I think that's, and which can be, as you said, Swachh Bharat can become another project, deriving the tool and then making it into certain other mode of operation. But there are a lot of other aspects that I think for a lot of artists who are, especially today when we are looking at Indian art practice, there are a lot of artists who are moving into the agrarian mode of practice. Artists who are doing farming, as a mode of practice, or artists who are almost trying to form a commune and work in certain specific locations. This whole discourse around Gandhi is, and I think the book very interestingly brings those smaller histories which are necessarily not connected to the image, because image constantly generates that abstraction which you mentioned in the book. But this combination of the two, I mean, where you are almost framing the outside within which you are looking at the images, was very inspiring for me. Yeah. And yeah.
So, I mean, I think if I was to take a leap of faith in a way, and knowing that how your practice is, you engage with participatory, performative actions in the public domain, can I dare say that Gandhi was one of the, was performing in a way as an artist almost?
Yeah,
No, creating
definitely
public spaces, using those actions as a way
I mean, the history of colonialism was a provocation for many to reconstruct their own identity in a certain way, whether it is Tagore or Gandhi. I mean, they were all looking at their own body also. It's not just looking
their
at
portrayal
culture.
and their
How
presence
they-
in the public space.
Yes, and they were
Yeah.
also proposing something, which is, I think, very important to this time, that public engagement is almost becoming like celebrating the present. It's almost becoming a kind of entertainment for the present. But I think all these important practitioners, they were proposing something for the future. They are proposing certain strategy. They are proposing certain tools of future constructions, which I think is a very important and learning thing for people who are working today, that how to, because Gandhi is not just proposing disobedience, he is also proposing alternatives. He is also proposing
Yep.
tools of how to
Yes.
reconstruct certain ideas. So many of the time protest becomes throwing stones. I mean, it doesn't go beyond that, but I think both in that way, Tagore, Gandhi, both are working on a certain kind of alternative way of looking at the future of a nation, or the idea of culture, in what way it should evolve in that way.
So, Sumathi, you may actually have
Very true.
introduced to the art world one of its earliest proponents of performative work and someone who has influenced generations of people, and we realize it through the text especially as well in your book, where other artists who are attempting to draw portraits of Gandhi feel about Gandhi when they encounter him for the first time, and his own
Correct.
critique of how he's being portrayed by
Yeah.
photographers or artists as if they are caricatures or incorrect portrayals of him. He did not agree with them, which means there was a way for him to also express how he wanted to be portrayed, which is the interesting
Correct.
twist of this man who seemingly gave up all worldly belongings, but wanted
Yeah.
to be portrayed in a certain way. Very actively
Correct.
pursued that, if I may
Yes.
say. And I will,
Yeah, I've argued.
if I may read a little text to explain how this was. Frida Das, you wrote in your book, an extract, encountered Gandhi in 1927 in Cuttack, and when she first saw him, she felt he was grandiose simplicity, or Buddha in contemplation. She refers to him as Buddha in contemplation, and that in a way framed this idea. Nandalal Bose, who we know was much favored by Gandhi, said one of his early meetings with Gandhi, "As I looked on him, he appeared to me like a sword of fine temper, kept unsheathed, having all the attributes of a sword except that of Himsa, and able to cut through the dark depths of human ignorance." So here we have one of the proponents, the foremost proponents of art, Nandalal Bose, being moved so much by the visual impact of Gandhi when he sees him first, to say, I would like to portray him that way. He even says of the second meeting later in Sevagram, and I again quote from your book, in the cottage at Sevagram, face to face with that great man, I squatted on the floor. "Come closer," he insisted. Knees touched knees. I took the dust of his feet. He did not object, rather willingly accepted it. Very important. His pity melted my heart into heavenly love. His eyes were clear, as if probing the depths of one's heart. I felt an urge to lay open my heart for his inspection and to tell him all that I wanted to tell. It's almost, I would be able to compare Gandhi's performativity to a contemporary artist, contemporary performative artist's work, where he draws in his audience into his circle to so much to influence the audience, in this case the artist, to portray him in a certain way and beautifully across generation. And this probably is a reason why there's very little critique of the man, at the same time a celebration of his ways. Maybe both of you can say a little bit about what you think about that. And Sanchayan, to you, I wanted to ask you, maybe after Sumathi responds, what does it mean to be an artist who has a practice of your kind, who has to exist within structures that are existing at the moment, yet push ahead an art of disobedience, which I know you do in a way, in a kind of a subvertive way. So Sumathi, first, can we hear what you want to say about this portrayal of Gandhi?
Yeah, thank you. And such wonderful comments from both of you. I've really appreciated it. As I did the research on the book, I became so convinced, exactly as Prateek you point out, that Gandhi is a master choreographer, as I think even I used that phrase, of his own image. So he was, even though he had this kind of ambivalence about art and he feigned a kind of disinterest in the work of the artists, he was so impatient with them. So many artists commented on how they couldn't get him to pose for him. He was absolutely opposed to that, though some did manage to succeed. But nevertheless, he was managing how he came across in the image. And I really think you're absolutely right. Gandhi was complicit in Brand Mahatma, right? He was actually participating in this. And I also think that part of the reason that the artist of India or any artist has responded so intensely to the figure of the Gandhi figure is they come to see him as a fellow artist. They see the kind of artistic gestures that he is undertaking, whether it comes to the manner in which he walks, whether it's the manner in which he spins, observes his fast. There is a way in which he presents his body and the work he's doing to the public, right? And that actually leads me perhaps to the most important point, which is Gandhi did everything publicly. He was visible, and that was part of his politics and his ethics, that nothing, the transparency of his actions, right? You could not launch a satyagraha campaign without declaring all of the many reasons you are planning to do this. Everything was out there in the open. He ate in the open, he slept in the open, he had arguments in the open. And I think that kind of visibility he offered is also something that artists pick up on. So I think there was this kind of partnership over time, in his own time, between Gandhi and the artists who came in contact with him. And then after his time, a partnership between the image of Gandhi and the artist, right? So I think that is one of the things I was very interested in, sort of in this short book. One could do so much more, especially in listening to both of you. I'm getting already so many ideas. I'm working on a paper on which in a lot of artwork now, the figure of Gandhi has disappeared and his various objects with which he did. Everything from his very humble sandals to the staff, to the spinning wheel, to his glasses, they come to stand in for him. But because the work has already been done by Gandhi himself in associating himself with these few objects, and then by the work of art in bringing the two together, you don't need the figure of Gandhi anymore. You show a particular watch and immediately you think, that is Gandhi. You show the glasses and you think that's Gandhi, right? So it's absolutely amazing. And Sanchayan's point about the materiality this immaterial Mahatma, right? Who wanted, who practiced aparigraha, as he called it, non-possession, getting rid of things. The fact that, he himself favored certain kinds of material practices is also fascinating. Yeah.
Before Chanchan, you move to the question I asked you about being a practicing artist. Now, I also want you to people who will read this book. There's a entire section in which he slowly, actually, publicly disrobes himself. He kind of sheds his clothes over time and lays bare almost his own body as a kind of a visual arresting image to the global audience, not just to in a way, I think, as a tool to attract attention. Anyway, so there are these very interesting aspects in the book that is fascinating. Sanchayan, tell me about what I asked earlier about what does it mean?
No, I think one of the important thing for today, I mean, when practitioners are engaging in public domain, and it's not a rejection of a certain kind against the other. It is more about acknowledging the differences and then engaging with it. Right. The multiplicity that exists in public domain. I think Gandhi is a master of that kind of a practice, where he is acknowledging the differences and then proposing a certain methodology, and also not looking at institution as this David and Goliath kind of a thing, but more as a method of engaging with the institutional tools, reworking them, re-engaging with them, and sometimes also proposing counter-institutional forms.
That's right.
In relationship to the strategy that is existing. I think much can be learned from how Gandhi is handling this whole idea of slowly making his body available is a kind of getting off a certain kind of institution.
Yes.
That with which he grew up, with a certain kind of a costume that was there, and slowly entering into another form of lifestyle,
right,
which is now moving into that direction. So it's also a kind of a not a kind of avant-garde-ish way of rejection at a certain point, the classic avant-garde-ish, but more of a kind of conversing protest.
Like embedding oneself within the institution and changing it from inside.
Yes, and working towards certain other alternatives that could open up a possibility for the future. I think that is very important for me, that it's always looking for a certain conversation of the future and
you're saying
looking at the
artists
present.
Today who are questioning institutions, the art of disobedience in a way, I mean not directly in that sense, are actually trying to engage and trying to find alternatives?
Yeah, I think they are investing time to understand how the institution functions, and then find ways to find new possibilities within it.
That's right.
And so it is more of expanding the space, and that's and not just like somebody gave a very interesting example of Ramkinkar Bej making these sculptures with throwing, but throwing not for breaking but constructing. I think it's a very
correct
throwing
a kind of a Gandhian methodology that you throw but you construct in the process also.
Yep.
I mean, so yeah, I mean, especially today, I think institution is also a historical phenomenon. It is not a moment in the time. It is also something that is evolving, that is also constructing, and there are a lot of things to be learned through certain history of institutional functioning.
Right.
And artistic practice is also investing time in that, to engage with those tools, to find those methods and incorporate them into as a practicing discipline. So
yeah. Yeah, if I can come in for just a second, Sanchayan, I liked what you said about the body becoming available. So it's making me think about how, one may even want to propose that Gandhi's body itself becomes a sort of canvas, right? If I can use an artistic metaphor. And in that Art of Bearing chapter, I was really interested in seeing, what we today call body art, right? Where artists use their bodies to actually perform art. We get a very interesting example in Gandhi for that. And as you know, from having read the book, I was very interested in Gandhi and color, right? One of the arguments in the chapter is how he made the color brown, which had been reviled and, in the sort of the colonial practice, valorizing of the color white. That the white skin is superior to the brown or the black skin, right? Gandhi proudly produces all that brown flesh on display, as I put it. And yet at the same time, and here I was really corrected in some regards by the wonderful Gandhian scholar Tridip Suhrud, who's been a wonderful mentor for me. I thought of Gandhi very much as a chromophobic, somebody who was opposed to bright colors. When you think of a Gandhian world, we really think of it as brown and white, right? And actually, many Gandhian women felt, that they were, in this wonderful world of Indian colors. Why would we have to only wear white? Or these kind of dull colors? But Gandhi apparently experimented in the ashram with all manner of dyes, color dyes that were natural rather than the chemically produced colors that the artists were using. So there is something wonderful there as well in the art world for us to think about, right? The very materials with which art is produced. How can you make them indigenous? How can you make them self-sustainable? How can you make them, in the world of climate change now, how can you make them climate friendly? So I think there are things to learn from, some Gandhian practices in that regard as well. So thank you for your comments.
I think we are almost time for us to close. I want to just point on the last image of the book, which is to me a very interesting image, because there's Bhupen Khakkar. We don't have an image of it, but maybe you guys can look at.
We do have an image. Actually, I put it.
The book in person. There's this massive sculpture of Gandhi, and Bhupen Khakkar, who's also portrayed Gandhi several times in his work, and almost sitting in his lap. There's a certain sense of care, or certain sense of being protected by Gandhi, and a beautiful photograph taken by Ram Rahman, who's a dear friend as well. And although there is that smile of Gandhi which is prevalent, this kind of smile that tells you that okay, there's a certain kind of love and care that comes through with the smile. The book, you've chosen to end with that image. Tell us why you chose that photograph to end with.
Thank you. And I think I've got the image. It's the very last slide, Rishabh, if you don't mind. You have to just move to the very last slide. And I wanted to end, of course, with an image, because this is a book about images, right? And you put it beautifully. There is a sense of care. I've interviewed Ram Rahman, and there's a playfulness. Gandhi was, of course, among many things, he was a very playful figure. So I think an artist like Bhupen, was known for his playfulness, had picked up also on Gandhi's playfulness in this. There is also the sense of the diminution, because Gandhi is this giant statue. And actually, I have to say, it is not one of my favorite Gandhi statues. It was apparently gifted to the Gandhi Darshan by and the records on this are not very clear in the Gandhi Darshan, but it's possibly gifted by a Russian sculptor. Speaking of the global interest as well in Gandhi, this image speaks to that. But why I wanted to end this book with this is to make the point that Gandhi co-participated with the artist. The artist recognizes that Gandhi is co-participating with them. And there's also this gesture in the way the hands are held, that he's blessing the artist, right? There's been a lot of Sanchayan, both Sanchayan and you have talked about the future, right? That a lot of art practice is projecting towards the future, that Gandhi himself had this kind of future. He wanted to leave a blueprint for the future, if you will. So it's almost as if he's encouraging artists of India to continue the work that they're doing, right? In spite of the fact, as I've said, he was very ambivalent about both art and artists. And I also love the fact that it's a photograph, because, as you know, one of the big arguments of the book is that the photographic image of Gandhi comes to replace, it comes to stand in for our image of Gandhi now. We have the way we principally remember Gandhi is through the photograph. So I also wanted to end the book because it is a photograph taken by a great photographer, Ram Rahman, Delhi-based photographer. So for all of those reasons, I chose to end the book that in this manner. I'm glad you thought it was a good way to end. Yeah.
Also, there's a very interesting section on photographs as well, photography and the role of photographer as an archivist, as a journalist photographer at the same time, a kind of intersection of art and representation of Gandhi in the global world. I think it's a very interesting chapter. On that note, thank you very much for coming this evening, and thank you for joining very early morning, Sumathi. Sanchayan, thank you for taking time out from your busy schedule to come and be part of this, and thank you, Voice of Value of Words. Sorry.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Sumathi, for being so present, bodily or otherwise. We've had a lot of talk about presenting the body. Well, thank you for being part of this session, and looking forward to seeing the book a little more than we have. We have copies.